more clarity on the war in Ukraine, on inflation and rates.
So that's a perfect place to pivot, Sacks. We are now here, and I think this is the 4th or 5th episode where we've been discussing the war, and we flipped it today just to do markets first for a little change of pace. And since we had Brad here, where are we at with the war? And what is your expectation of it wrapping up or it escalating?
Well, actually, there's a tweet storm this morning that Chamath, you sent to the group that from a Russian official, and it seemed to indicate, it indicated what we've kind of known for a few weeks now, which is what the broad contours of what a peace deal would look like, which is there's 3 main pieces. Neutrality for Ukraine. The Russians insist that it not be part of NATO. They get to keep Crimea, which they annexed in 2014. That's been a fait accompli. And then some version of independence for these sort of breakaway territories in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region. Everyone kind of knows that's the broad strokes of the deal. Then there's, a lot of details that are going to matter a lot to the people who live there. Like, is there this land bridge from Crimea to Donbass? But frankly, don't matter as much to all of us, the United States of America. So the question is, what is the administration going to do about it? Biden just went to Europe. And, my concern is that no one in Washington, and I talked about this last week, seems to be pushing for a ceasefire. It seems like their preferred position is for Russia to bleed out as long as possible in Ukraine, for the U.S. to fund an insurgency a la Afghanistan, where, these fighters in eastern Ukraine are sort of like the Mujahideen.
Insurgency? Is that the right word?
Well, sure, because, if
they're defending their own land.
And so are the Mujahideen. I mean,
I know, but why would you call it an insurgency? Well, they're defending their land.
If the government of Ukraine falls, then it becomes an insurgency. So the point is that the administration, the question is, what's the administration's end game here? Do they want to lead the world to a ceasefire, or do they want to protract the conflict to impose on the Russian state a Afghan-style, debilitating defeat to destabilize the Russian regime? Neil Ferguson had a column this week in it's his Bloomberg column.
He's from the Brookings Institute at Stanford.
No, he's from Hoover.
Hoover, rather. Sorry.
Yeah. So I'll read this part.
Hoover is at. Could you just explain to people what the Hoover Institute is and how that leans?
Hoover Institution for War and Peace. I would say it sort of leans idealistic in foreign policy. I would describe Neil as sort of the most realistic idealist.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for the context.
But he's quite well sourced, I think, with various people in Washington and Europe. And what he wrote is, the U.S. intends to keep this war going. The administration will continue to supply the Ukrainians with anti-aircraft Stingers, anti-tank Javelins, explosive switchblade drones. It will keep trying to persuade other NATO governments to supply heavier defensive weaponry, and so on. He says Washington will revert to the Afghanistan after 1979 playbook of supplying an insurgency only if the Ukrainian government loses the conventional war. So the concern here is that the U.S. government has an incentive, actually, that they don't want a quick end to this war, is basically the theory, is they want the Russian state to bleed out and be destabilized.
In a way, it's the one chance we have for like regime change there without us actually starting a war, is that they have this self-inflicted wound. That is the theory.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are saying that. That is what a lot of people want in Washington. This is not like conspiracy theory. People are saying this is our chance to topple the Russian state, to destabilize it. There was a Rand Corporation
How do you feel about that?
survey done a few years ago. Hold on. There's a Rand Corporation study done a few years ago that was commissioned by somebody, probably in our State Department or someone like that, where they talked about this, that if we want to destabilize the Russian regime, Ukraine is the way to do it.
Right. They would fall for it, right? They would actually fight that fight. That is an unwinnable fight. We would basically be we'd be supporting an Afghanistan-like path for them to go down like we did. And they did previously to that.
Right. And the problem that I see is just this, which is we've discussed on this program the downsides of this war. First, it's a humanitarian disaster. Second, we've talked about the risks of recession later in the year. Third, Friedberg talked about famine, the risk of famine later this year if the spring planting doesn't happen. And then fourth, we always have this risk that the war spins out of control and goes nuclear, right? And leads into World War III. Those are some vital American interests to avoid all of those scenarios. I don't see an equivalent vital American interest in determining the exact nuances of who rules the Donbass. In other words, the broad strokes of this agreement are there. What the U.S. should be doing is leading. They should be pushing for lead, not bleed. Lead the way to a ceasefire, not to inflict maximum damage on the Russian regime.
Which we don't know exactly what their intent is because they're doing this behind closed doors. Brad, what's your take on this?
I think David and I talked about this at dinner the other night. I think there's something bigger playing out here. I mean, clearly he's the expert on realpolitik, and but it seems to me that we have had decades of military diplomacy, right? And most recently, the PAL doctrine of overwhelming force. We don't want to make the same mistake we made in Vietnam, so we're going to go in with full force. And basically, the public doesn't support, military adventurism anymore, right? And so now we have, maybe we'll call it the Blinken doctrine, which is the PAL doctrine equivalent, but for economic force. It's the nuclear economic weapon that is on full display by the West right now that I think has really significant implications, right? It's reunited the West. And I don't think this is just about Putin. And I think the reason that the U.S. and Western Europe is slow playing this a bit is they're sending a message to the Chinese as well, which is that we are unified and we will use an economic weapon of mass destruction if, right, you don't play by global norms. And so the box I think we're in from a negotiating perspective, right, in Ukraine right now is not a box around neutrality. I mean, neutrality is already clear. I mean, Zelenskyy didn't even ask for a no-fly zone. He's not even asking for NATO membership. They've already ceded neutrality. I think the real question is sanctions. I don't think the West wants to roll back sanctions. And I think Putin's saying, I can't hightail it out of here unless you roll back all the sanctions and give me a little bit of the Donbass. And so watch the next week or two, like in any good negotiation. Unfortunately, I think both sides are going to amp up their current strategies. We may see missiles coming out of Russia, and we may see complete European embargo of Russian oil, 3 million barrels a day. Those will be the final straws, right, before we enter negotiations, because then they can cede the last things that they took as part of the negotiation. But this, I think, is going to be all about economic sanctions. And I think the West is playing a really strong game. What I worry about, and Sacks has talked about this at length, is that we overreach, we overplay our hand here in an effort to send a signal to other parties around the world, right? And that has fat tail risk associated with it. That
You're referencing China and Taiwan?
Let me ask a question. How many of us woke up at the beginning of this year or in making our New Year's resolutions and said that we need to risk recession, famine, and war in order to destabilize and topple the Russian regime? When did this become a vital American interest? No one at the beginning of the year thought this was an important goal of America. What's more important is basically getting our economy back on track, after this long this plague we've had. I mean, nobody needed this problem. And what the administration should have done was use diplomacy and all of their resources to try and prevent the conflict. And now the conflict has occurred, we should be pushing for a negotiated peace and ceasefire. We do not have a vital national interest in the details of who rules the Donbass.
Yeah, the problem with your setting up of that question is that we did not start the war. Putin did. Chamath, you've been silent so far. What are your thoughts on this war that Putin
Jason, I'm
started?
not saying we started the war.
Well, you're saying, did we wake up and say that we should do this? We did not.
Listen,
Putin
you
put
woke
his
up
troops
on
the
and a lot of
border.
other people in the media woke up on February 24th, and you think Putin went mad and there's no prehistory to this conflict. Now, here's the deal. Hold on a second. This is a war of Russian aggression. It's true that Putin started it. He's the invader. However, there were things we could have done to prevent or to avoid this war. And American diplomacy completely failed. And we even discussed it the month before this war started. We talked about how the U.S. could have given a written guarantee to Russia that Ukraine would not be part of NATO. Just this week, Zelenskyy, in an interview with Fried Zakaria, admitted he was told by Blinken, you will not be part of NATO, but we don't want to admit that publicly. What games were they playing? What is the point of playing that kind of game with the grave issue of war and peace? Why didn't Blinken say publicly what he said to Zelenskyy? This administration did not do everything it could do to prevent war. And now we are faced with all of these existential risks. Why? For what reason?
The reason is that it gave the United States an opportunity to topple Russia. I mean,
exactly. Who of us thought we needed that at the beginning of this year?
Well, I think that, the thing to keep in mind, and I'm not saying that this is right, but I'm just game theorizing, that these are like, grudges that these guys have held for a very long time. And I think it started when they were in the Obama White House and it carried over to now. And I think they saw an opportunity to basically execute a strategy that essentially now I think we're moving into the second phase of this war, which is effectively trying to bait Russia into doing something really egregiously bad. And that is terrible, David, to your point. I think we're willing to, sacrifice a lot. I think we've decided that implicitly based on the actions of the American government. And it's weird. It's like we're trying to get Russia to react. And so the rhetoric, in fact, since that, do you guys remember, I think it was only 10 days ago that both Russia and Ukraine said the surface area of a deal is pretty much in sight. Friedberg from the top rope coming in. Look at you, Friedberg. I mean, like you look like an everyman. I mean, I'm so proud of you. Are you actually driving your own car?
Gas guzzling car, SUV in the mountains.
Well, you should be.
Is
you
that
should.
Putin's
You should
gas
be
in that
canceled.
tank? Whose gas is in that tank? Is that Putin's gas?
I only use ethanol I make in vats in my backyard.
I went out of my way.
use solar panels that are handcrafted in my backyard.
I went out of my way to find a Luke oil gas station filled up.
What I was saying, guys, was that, from the 10 days from when, both sides, Russia and Ukraine, were like, hey, we think we're basically there, we have a deal. The rhetoric has gotten really insane. Yesterday, I think it was like the United States said, we think that Russia should be kicked out of the G20. Then Russia responded and said, I'm only going to sell nat gas and settle it in rubles. All of a sudden, other actors, China and Saudi Arabia are in the game now. China and Saudi Arabia are negotiating, settling a huge oil trade in yuan. Why in the last 10 days have all these things happened when we were so close to getting something done? I think the best explanation is that we are willing to, I guess we've decided, I mean, none of us have decided, but the American government has decided that some amount of sacrifice is okay if it could trigger a Russian escalation, which could then further destabilize that country. And I think they believe that that's more important than anything else.
And I think from where I sit, I think we can take Putin at his word that he actually cares about reunification. And that's not to say he's crazy, David. And I don't think we can control his behavior. I think
when does he ever use the word reunification?
He's never said that, Jason. And also just today, the Russian military, the tweet that I sent you guys was from the Russian military. And that was an official statement. And I don't think they would be allowed without Putin's explicit sign off. They no longer talked about denazificating Ukraine or demilitarizing Ukraine. They simply focused it on the Donbass. And to use your Sun Tzu argument, it's almost like they're trying to construct their own golden bridge to exit in a way where they can claim victory to the Russian people, to explain the tens of thousands of, Russian military people that have been killed in this whole conflict, right? Because they have an explanation that they have to give. But in all of this, I think that we're probably exposing a very high-risk game of poker that we're playing, which is, it seems that the U.S. government is focused more on the destabilization of Russia than they are on getting this conflict behind us.
I mean, he did say in his speech, since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians.
That's Donbass.
Yeah, I know, but he is...
There's been a civil war going on since 2014 in this Donbass region between Ukrainians and these Russian speakers. And now that civil war this is a Balkan-style civil war that is now escalated with, Ukraine and Russia getting in, and now the whole West potentially could get in. This is a very dangerous situation that we should not let spin out of control.
I'm agreeing with that. You guys asked me, did he ever talk about reunification? He did. He did in his speech about Ukraine.
That was not one of his stated war objectives. Now, you could keep accusing him of being a liar, but look, what his objectives...
I'm just taking him at his word that he believes these areas are Russian and they should be considered Russian.
The Donbass area, where they are predominantly Russian speakers. Look,
okay, and that's
I'm not taking a side.
Yeah.
I'm not taking a side in who should rule the Donbass, okay?
Yeah.
I think it's a complicated ethnic strife sort of issue like we saw in the Balkans all the time between the Russians who live there and the Ukrainians who live there. What I do know is it's not worth risking World War III over
We're
that
in agreement
kind
on
of
that.
issue.
100% agreement. 100%.